They didn't invite me to the reunion, so I rented the entire venue. The invitation never came, but that was fine by me. Sarah Chen had always been forgotten anyway, the quiet girl who sat in the back corner of every class at Millbrook High, invisible to the popular kids who now ran the reunion committee. But 20 years had changed everything. My tech startup had sold for $47 million last spring, and suddenly I had the power to make them all remember my name. I called the Grandview Manor on Monday morning, the same historic venue they had booked for Saturday night, my voice steady as I spoke to the manager, Mrs. Patterson, a woman who recognized money when she heard it. I told her I needed to cancel their existing reservation, that I would pay triple their deposit, plus damages, plus a generous bonus for the inconvenience. She hesitated for exactly 12 seconds before agreeing, the sound of greed winning over professionalism crystal clear through the phone. The reunion committee found out Tuesday afternoon. I watched from my downtown office as my phone buzzed with angry calls and texts. Melissa Rodriguez, head cheerleader turned real estate agent, left 3 voicemails that progressively increased in pitch and desperation. Brad Morrison, former quarterback now selling insurance in his father's agency, sent a series of increasingly hostile messages that revealed just how little his vocabulary had expanded since graduation, but none of them had my new number. They were still trying to reach the Sarah Chen who had worked at the local library after college, not the Sarah Chen who now owned a penthouse overlooking the city. By Wednesday, the panic had spread through their social media groups like wildfire. I had created fake accounts years ago to monitor their pathetic attempts at staying relevant. Suburban wives posting filtered selfies and middle-aged men reliving their glory days through high school football highlights. Watching them scramble to find a new venue on such short notice brought me more satisfaction than my first $1 million profit margin. Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my office, Detective James Murphy, a man I remembered from our graduating class. Though he had been 3 years ahead of me, his badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he sat across from my mahogany desk, his questions carefully phrased but clearly aimed at understanding my motivations. Apparently Melissa had filed some sort of complaint about harassment and financial manipulation, as if having money and using it strategically was somehow criminal. Sarah, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority mixed with something that might have been curiosity, they're saying you're trying to sabotage their reunion out of spite, that you never got over being excluded from their group in high school. I leaned back in my leather chair, studying his face for any sign of the boy who used to eat lunch alone in the library, before he found his place on the debate team, before he discovered that intelligence could be its own form of popularity. Detective Murphy, I replied, letting my voice carry just enough ice to make my point. I'm a businesswoman who saw an opportunity to rent a beautiful venue for a private event. If my former classmates are upset about losing their reservation, perhaps they should have planned better. He left with no grounds for any charges, but his visit had planted a seed of something darker in my mind. The reunion committee wasn't just angry about losing their venue, they were genuinely afraid of what I might be planning, and perhaps they had good reason to be. Friday evening, I stood in the empty ballroom of Grandview Manor, the crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across the polished marble floor. The space was magnificent, exactly the kind of place where important things happened, where secrets were revealed and lives were changed forever. I had told Mrs. Patterson that I would be hosting a small gathering for business associates, a celebration of a recent acquisition, but the truth was far more complex than that. The boxes arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, delivered by a discreet service that specialized in confidential packages. Inside were 23 manila folders, each labeled with a name from my graduating class, each containing information that would make their middle-aged suburban lives very interesting indeed. Hiring a private investigator had been expensive, but the results were worth every penny. Melissa Rodriguez had been embezzling from her real estate clients, skimming money from escrow accounts to fund her shopping addiction and her son's private school tuition. The evidence was thorough, bank statements and forged documents that would make her career disappear overnight. Brad Morrison had been having an affair with his business partner's wife for the past 3 years. The photographs were explicit enough to destroy both his marriage and his professional relationships. But those were just the appetizers. The main course involved something much darker, something that had been buried for 20 years but never forgotten, something that connected half the reunion committee to a night that had changed my life forever, even if they had convinced themselves that nobody would ever find out. October 15, 2004, senior year, the night of homecoming. I had stayed late in the chemistry lab to finish a project that was due Monday. The hallways were empty except for the distant sound of music from the gymnasium where the dance was in full swing. I was gathering my notes when I heard voices coming from the senior lounge, voices that belonged to people who should have been at the dance. I should have left immediately, should have pretended I never heard anything, but curiosity had always been my weakness. I crept closer to the partially open door, my heart pounding as I recognized the speakers. There was Melissa, her voice high and panicked, Brad Morrison trying to sound calm but failing, and 3 others whose faces I could see through the crack in the door, all of them surrounding something on the floor, something that looked like a person. "She's not breathing," Melissa had whispered, her homecoming queen crown askew on her perfectly styled hair. "Oh God, she's not breathing." "Shut up," Brad had hissed, his tuxedo jacket stained with something dark. "Just shut up and let me think." The person on the floor was Amanda Walsh, a junior who had been dating Brad's best friend. Her dress was torn and there was blood pooling beneath her head. She wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound at all, and the 5 most popular students in school were standing over her like they had just committed murder. Which, as it turned out, they had. I backed away from the door as quietly as possible, my hands shaking as I gathered my things and slipped out through the side exit. By Monday morning, Amanda Walsh was just another tragic accident, a girl who had fallen down the main staircase during homecoming night, apparently intoxicated despite being underage. Her death ruled accidental by a coroner who owed favors to half the parents on the school board. But I knew better. I had seen them standing over her body, had heard the panic in their voices, had watched them construct their lie in real time, and for 20 years I had carried that knowledge like a cancer eating away at my insides, watching them go on with their lives while Amanda rotted in Millbrook Cemetery. The private investigator had been thorough, very thorough, and what he had uncovered made my blood run cold. Amanda hadn't just fallen down the stairs, she had been pushed, and not by accident. She had been threatening to expose Brad's steroid use, his father's illegal gambling operation, and the web of corruption that connected the police chief, the mayor, and half the school board. The 5 students who had been in that room, Melissa Rodriguez, Brad Morrison, Jennifer Hayes, David Park, and Michael Stevens, had been protecting more than just themselves. They had been protecting an entire network of adult criminals who couldn't afford to have their secrets exposed by a 17-year-old girl with a conscience. Saturday evening arrived like a storm front, dark and heavy with the promise of violence. I stood in my penthouse apartment, adjusting the black dress I had chosen for the occasion, something elegant but severe, appropriate for both a funeral and a reckoning. The reunion committee had managed to secure the community center across town, a shabby venue with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs, perfect for the kind of people they had become. At exactly 7:30, I arrived at Grandview Manor. The valet took my keys with professional courtesy, and I walked through the main entrance like I owned the place, which technically I did for the evening. The ballroom was exactly as I had left it, elegant and empty, waiting for the guests who would never come. Instead, I had invited 5 very special people, sent them each a personal message that afternoon with an address and a time, told them I had something important to discuss about their high school days, something that couldn't wait, something that involved Amanda Walsh. The messages were carefully crafted to sound urgent but not threatening, curious but not accusatory, designed to make them come alone and on time. Melissa arrived first, her heels clicking nervously on the marble floor as she entered the ballroom. She had aged well, expensive clothes and professional makeup hiding the lines that worry and guilt had carved around her eyes, but I could see the recognition dawn on her face as she realized who had summoned her here. "Sarah Chen," she said, her voice trying for casual but landing somewhere near terrified. "I got your message. What's this about exactly?" I smiled, the kind of smile that rich people learn to perfect, cold and sharp and completely without warmth. "Hello Melissa, thank you for coming. We're just waiting for the others to arrive, then we can begin." Brad came next, followed closely by Jennifer Hayes, now Jennifer Patterson, married to a dentist and mother of twin boys. David Park arrived precisely on time, his lawyer's instincts making him suspicious of anything unscheduled or unofficial. Michael Stevens was the last to arrive, looking around the empty ballroom with the kind of confusion that suggested he genuinely hadn't understood my message. "What the hell is this?" Brad demanded, his voice carrying the same entitled aggression that had made him so popular in high school. "Some kind of joke. Where is everyone?" "Everyone who matters is here," I replied, walking to the center of the room where a single table had been set up with 6 chairs, 5 manila folders arranged in a neat row, and a laptop computer open to a video call that was being recorded by cameras hidden throughout the room. They followed me reluctantly, their body language shifting from confusion to concern to outright fear as they recognized each other. as they began to understand that this wasn't a coincidence, that someone had deliberately gathered the 5 people who had been in the senior lounge on October 15, 2004. "Sit," I commanded, my voice echoing slightly in the large space. They obeyed without thinking, high school hierarchies dying hard even after 20 years, the popular kid still responding to authority when it was presented with enough confidence. I remained standing, looking down at them like a teacher addressing particularly disappointing students. 20 years ago, you killed Amanda Walsh, I said simply, no preamble, no explanation, just the truth hanging in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The silence that followed was deafening. 5 adults who had built entire lives on a foundation of lies suddenly confronted with the one person who knew their secret, who had always known their secret, who had spent 2 decades planning exactly this moment. Melissa was the first to break. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you saw, but Amanda's death was an accident. Everyone knows that. The police investigated, the coroner ruled. It was just a terrible accident." "I was there," I said quietly, my words cutting through her denial like a blade through silk. "I saw you standing over her body, heard you planning your story, watched you turn murder into an accident with nothing more than fear and family connections." David's lawyer training kicked in. Even if that were true, which it isn't, you couldn't prove anything after all this time. Statutes of limitations, lack of evidence, your word against ours. I opened the laptop and turned it so they could see the screen, where a video file was queued and ready to play. "Actually, David, I can prove quite a lot. You see, I've spent the last 5 years preparing for this conversation, hired professionals, gathered evidence, documented everything." The video began to play, security footage from the school that night, timestamp clearly visible, showing 5 figures entering the building through a side door at 9:47 p.m., Amanda Walsh following them inside 6 minutes later, the same 5 figures leaving together at 11:23 p.m., no Amanda Walsh in sight. The official investigation claimed Amanda fell down the main staircase at approximately 10:15 p.m. I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, but as you can see, she was still alive and walking into the building almost an hour later, which means the entire timeline was fabricated. Jennifer started crying, quiet tears that ruined her carefully applied makeup. "We were kids, Sarah, we were just kids who made a terrible mistake." "Amanda Walsh was also a kid," I replied, feeling no sympathy for the woman who had helped cover up murder. "A kid who deserved to live, to graduate, to go to college, to have the life that all of you stole from her." Brad slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the ballroom like a gunshot. "Enough of this dramatic bullshit. What do you want? Money? Is this some kind of elaborate blackmail scheme?" I smiled again, that same cold expression that had been practicing in mirrors for months. "Blackmail is such an ugly word, Brad. I prefer to think of this as a business proposition. You see, each of you has built very comfortable lives on the foundation of Amanda's death, successful careers, happy families, community respect, all of it paid for with the blood of a 17-year-old girl." I picked up the first manila folder, Melissa's name written in neat block letters across the tab. Melissa Rodriguez Morrison, real estate agent, mother of 2, pillar of the community, also a thief who has stolen over $200,000 from client escrow accounts. The evidence is quite comprehensive: bank records, forged documents, testimony from 3 different witnesses. Her face went white. "You can't, my children, my husband, this would destroy my family." "The way you destroyed Amanda's family," I countered, opening the second folder. Brad Morrison, insurance agent, high school football hero, devoted husband and father, also an adulterer who has been sleeping with Rebecca Chin, wife of his business partner David Chin. The photographs are quite explicit. I'm sure your wife Jennifer would find them very educational. Brad's confident facade crumbled. "Sarah, please, you don't understand. Rebecca and I, it's complicated." "Murder usually is," I replied, moving to the third folder. Jennifer Hayes Patterson, dental hygienist, soccer mom, PTA president, also a prescription drug addict who has been stealing narcotics from her husband's practice and selling them to high school students, including her own son's classmates. Jennifer's sobs became louder, more desperate. "I needed help, the stress, the guilt, I couldn't sleep, couldn't function, the pills were the only thing that made it stop." David Park, criminal defense attorney, partner at Morrison, Park and Associates, respected member of the Bar Association, also guilty of witness tampering, evidence suppression, and bribery in at least 6 different cases. The State Ethics Board would be very interested in these documents. David's legal mind was working frantically. those are privileged communications, attorney-client privilege, you can't use any of that. Actually I can, I said, enjoying the panic in his eyes, because you weren't representing these clients, you were conspiring with them, which makes you a co-conspirator rather than their attorney. Privilege doesn't apply to criminal conspiracies. The last folder belonged to Michael Stevens, and his contents were perhaps the most damaging of all. Michael Stevens, high school guidance counselor, trusted mentor to hundreds of students over the past 15 years, also a predator who has been grooming and sexually abusing female students. The evidence includes recorded phone calls, text messages, and testimony from 7 different victims. Michael finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Those girls, they came to me for help. They were troubled, broken, I was trying to help them. You were trying to help yourself, I corrected, disgusted by his attempt at justification, just like you helped yourself to Amanda's life 20 years ago. The 5 of them sat in stunned silence, their carefully constructed lives crumbling around them like a house of cards in a hurricane, each of them realizing that their secrets, their crimes, their lies were about to become very public knowledge. So here's my proposition, I continued, pacing slowly around their table like a predator circling wounded prey. You have 2 choices. You can face the consequences of your actions, both past and present, watch as your lives, your families, your reputations are destroyed by the truth, or you can choose a different path. Melissa looked up at me with desperate hope. What kind of path? I stopped pacing and faced them directly. Confession, public admission of guilt, complete honesty about what happened to Amanda Walsh, followed by surrender to the proper authorities, justice delayed but not denied. Brad laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. You're insane if you think we're going to confess to murder. We have lives, families, responsibilities. We're not throwing that all away for some dead girl from 20 years ago. That dead girl had a name, I said, my voice rising for the first time that evening. Amanda Walsh. She was 17 years old. She played violin in the school orchestra. She volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. She was planning to study veterinary medicine at State University. She had dreams and hopes and people who loved her, and you murdered her because she threatened to expose your pathetic little secrets. Jennifer wiped her eyes with a tissue that was already soaked with tears and mascara. We didn't mean for her to die. It was an accident. We were just trying to scare her, to make her keep quiet. You pushed her down a flight of concrete stairs, I replied, my research having uncovered even more details than I had shared. You held her arms while Brad shoved her backwards. You watched her head crack against the bottom step. You checked her pulse and realized she was dead, and then you moved her body to make it look like she had fallen down the main staircase. David was studying me with the calculating look of a lawyer trying to find weaknesses in an opponent's case. You seem to know an awful lot of specific details for someone who claims to have just overheard a conversation. I had been waiting for this question, had prepared for it carefully, because I didn't just overhear a conversation, David, I recorded it. You see, I had been working on a project about acoustic properties in different parts of the school building. I had recording equipment set up in the senior lounge to measure sound reflection and absorption. Your entire confession was captured on digital audio. The blood drained from all 5 faces simultaneously, 20 years of security suddenly evaporating like morning mist. That's impossible, Melissa whispered. If you had a recording, why didn't you go to the police? Because I was 17 years old and terrified, I admitted, because your parents controlled half the town. Because I knew that even with evidence, you would find a way to make it disappear, because I was smart enough to realize that revenge is a dish best served cold. Michael found his voice again. So what? You've spent 20 years planning this, building a fortune just so you could destroy our lives. That's not justice, that's obsession. Justice and obsession aren't mutually exclusive, I replied. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes the only way to balance the scales is to become the weight that tips them. I walked back to the laptop and opened a new window, showing them a live stream of the local news website. In exactly 1 hour, this recording will be released simultaneously to every major news outlet in the state, along with all the evidence of your individual crimes. Your faces will be on every television screen, your names in every newspaper, your secrets exposed for the entire world to see. Brad stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. You can't do this. We have families, children, innocent people who will be hurt by your vendetta. Amanda Walsh had a family too, I said calmly, parents who spent 20 years believing their daughter died in a drunken accident, who blamed themselves for not being stricter about alcohol, who carried guilt that belonged to you, her little sister Emma, who was only 14 when Amanda died, who grew up thinking her big sister was irresponsible and reckless instead of murdered. The mention of Emma Walsh seemed to hit them particularly hard, perhaps because she had been young enough to be innocent, untouched by the corruption that had consumed everyone else. "Emma doesn't need to know," Jennifer pleaded. "She's moved on, she has her own life now. Why hurt her with the truth?" "Because the truth is what she deserves," I answered, "because living a lie isn't really living at all, because Amanda's memory deserves better than the fiction you created." David was back in lawyer mode, searching for angles, for leverage, for anything that could salvage the situation. "What you're doing is illegal, extortion, coercion, you're committing crimes yourself." "Possibly," I agreed, "but unlike you, I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions. Unlike you, I'm not hiding behind lies and cover-ups. Unlike you, I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." Melissa was hyperventilating, her breath coming in short gasps as the reality of her situation sank in. "Please, Sarah, please, there has to be another way. I'll do anything, pay anything, just please don't destroy my children's lives." "Your children will survive," I said without sympathy. "They'll be embarrassed, they'll face difficult questions, they'll learn that their mother isn't the person they thought she was, but they'll survive." Amanda Walsh didn't get that chance. The hour was almost up. 57 minutes had passed since I had started my presentation. In 3 minutes the automated system would release 20 years of carefully gathered evidence to a dozen different news organizations, and the 5 people sitting before me would become the most infamous criminals in the state's recent history. "Last chance," I announced, looking at each of them in turn. "Confession or exposure, justice or destruction, the choice is yours, but the time is now." They looked at each other desperately. 5 middle-aged people who had built their entire adult lives on the foundation of a teenage crime. 5 successful professionals who were about to lose everything they had worked for. 5 murderers who had finally run out of places to hide. Brad was the first to speak, his voice hollow and defeated. "If we confess, if we turn ourselves in, will you destroy the other evidence, the personal stuff? Our families don't need to be destroyed too." "Your family stopped being my concern the moment you decided to cover up murder," I replied, "but I'm not unreasonable. Confession gets you life in prison instead of the death penalty, cooperation gets you the possibility of parole, truth gets you the chance to face your children with some shred of dignity intact." Jennifer was crying again. "We were kids, we made one terrible mistake, one moment of panic, and you want us to throw away 40 years of life because of it." "Amanda Walsh threw away 60 years of life because of it," I countered. 40 years seems like a bargain by comparison." The laptop chimed softly, a pleasant sound that meant the automated release was now 60 seconds away. 30 seconds to decide, I announced. Confession or exposure, redemption or ruin. Michael stood up slowly, his face aged a decade in the past hour. "I can't, I won't, my students need me, the school needs me, I've helped hundreds of kids over the years." "You've abused dozens of girls over the years," I corrected. "The help you gave them came with a price they shouldn't have had to pay." David was frantically calculating odds. "The statute of limitations on murder in this state is..." "Wait, there is no statute of limitations on murder, we could still be prosecuted." "Yes," I confirmed, "you could still be prosecuted and convicted and sentenced to life in prison, assuming you lived long enough to serve the full term." Melissa suddenly looked up at me with an expression of desperate cunning. "You were there that night. You saw what happened and didn't report it. That makes you an accessory after the fact. You could be charged too." "I could," I agreed, "and I'm prepared for that possibility. Unlike you, I've made peace with the consequences of my choices." The laptop chimed again. 15 seconds remaining. "Final answer," I said, my finger hovering over the enter key that would release everything. "Confession or exposure." Brad grabbed Melissa's hand, his voice urgent and panicked. "We have to confess. We have to tell the truth. It's the only way to protect our families." "No," David said firmly, "we stick to the story. We deny everything. We claim Sarah is mentally unstable, that she's fabricated evidence out of some sick obsession." Jennifer was hyperventilating again. "I can't go to prison. I can't. My boys need me. They're only 12 years old." Michael was staring at the floor, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter. "Amanda, I'm sorry Amanda, I'm so sorry." 5 seconds remaining. I looked at each of them one final time. 5 people who had shaped my entire adult life without even knowing it. 5 murderers who were about to face justice after 20 years of freedom they had never deserved. "Time's up," I said, and pressed enter. The screen immediately filled with confirmation messages. dozens of news outlets receiving the complete package of evidence simultaneously. There was no taking it back now, no last-minute deals or desperate bargains. The truth was spreading across the internet like wildfire, and by morning the entire state would know what had really happened to Amanda Walsh. Melissa screamed, a sound of pure anguish that echoed through the empty ballroom. Brad collapsed back into his chair like a puppet with severed strings. Jennifer fainted completely, her body hitting the marble floor with a sickening thud. David was already on his phone, probably calling his own lawyer. Michael continued staring at the floor, mumbling apologies to a girl who had been dead for 20 years. I closed the laptop and gathered my things. My work here was finished. Justice had been served even if it had taken 2 decades to arrive. Amanda Walsh would finally have the truth told about her death, and 5 murderers would finally face the consequences of their actions. As I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking on the marble floor just as Melissa's had when she arrived, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years, peace. The weight that had been crushing my chest since October 15, 2004 finally lifted, leaving me free to breathe again. Behind me, I could hear David shouting into his phone, Melissa sobbing hysterically, Michael still mumbling his inadequate apologies. The sound of their world crashing down around them was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I paused at the door and looked back one final time. 5 broken people in an elegant ballroom, their carefully constructed lies finally exposed to the harsh light of truth, their comfortable lives about to become very uncomfortable indeed. Goodbye, I said softly, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to them or to Amanda or to the girl I had been 20 years ago, the girl who had been too scared to speak up when it mattered most. The valet brought my car around without comment, professional discretion being part of what I had paid for. I tipped him generously and drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past the high school where it had all started, past the cemetery where Amanda was buried, past the houses where my former classmates had built their lives on the foundation of murder. By the time I reached my penthouse, the story was already breaking on the late news. Grainy footage of 5 people being led away from Grandview Manor in handcuffs, their faces hidden behind jackets and hands, their reputations destroyed in the space of a single news cycle. I poured myself a glass of wine, expensive champagne that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and stood on my balcony overlooking the city lights. Somewhere out there, Amanda Walsh's parents were learning the truth about their daughter's death. Somewhere out there, Emma Walsh was discovering that her sister had been murdered. Somewhere out there, 5 families were beginning to understand the true cost of keeping deadly secrets. The reunion had happened after all, just not the way anyone had expected. Instead of celebrating the past, we had finally confronted it. Instead of reminiscing about high school glory days, we had faced the darkest night of our teenage years. Instead of dancing to old songs, we had heard the sound of justice finally being served. I raised my glass to the city below, to Amanda Walsh whose death had finally been avenged, to the truth that had taken 20 years to surface, to the girl I had been and the woman I had become. They didn't invite me to the reunion, I said aloud, my words carried away by the night wind, so I rented the entire venue. The champagne tasted like victory, like closure, like the end of a very long and very dark chapter. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and interviews and probably criminal charges of my own, but tonight I was finally free from the weight of someone else's secret, finally able to sleep without hearing Amanda Walsh's voice in my dreams. 20 years later, justice had arrived fashionably late to the party, but it had arrived nonetheless, and that was all that mattered in the end.